Evolutionary biologist and podcaster Bret Weinstein should believe in God. At least, he should believe in God, given what he considers to be his guiding principle when it comes to getting at the truth. Ironically, Weinstein cites this very principle as his primary reason for being an atheist. So, what is that principle? Let's listen to Weinstein explain it to Tucker Carlson.
I've come to the conclusion that there probably isn't such a creator, because all of the things that we have been able to figure out about the world, things that we know are true because they carry a great deal of predictive power, have come to us through the principle of parsimony. And I will clean up the principle of parsimony a little bit because the way it was originally formulated is clumsy. But if we had access to all the information, then the simplest explanation for each pattern that we observe would be the correct one.
Right.
Simplicity is our guide to what's true.
The cornerstone of Weinstein's atheism, then, is what he calls the principle of parsimony. What Weinstein labels the principle of parsimony is often referred to as the criterion of simplicity among philosophers. And the idea is this: when it comes to theory selection, or on a larger scale, worldview comparison, the theory which can explain a given data set with the fewest fundamental commitments is to be preferred, all things considered. And this is because simpler theories are more likely to be true than theories that are more complex. I think that Weinstein is absolutely correct when he says that the principle of parsimony, or simplicity, is a guide to truth. In fact, it's a principle we use all the time to get at the truth. In our everyday lives, we naturally prefer simpler explanations to those that are contrived, convoluted, and complicated. For example, if tomorrow morning you wake up and find that your car is missing from the driveway, you won't jump to the conclusion that aliens beamed it up while you slept. Rather, you'd likely conclude that it was stolen by a car thief. Although both scenarios are broadly possible, logically speaking, the car thief hypothesis is far simpler than the alien hypothesis because it doesn't introduce extra explanatory commitments into the picture. The thief explanation is considerably more parsimonious than the alien explanation, and therefore far more likely to be true. The principle of parsimony is a reliable guide to truth, then, because simple theories or explanations are more inherently probable than complicated ones. And it's not hard to see why. The more complicated a theory is, the more parts and elements are involved, the more ways there are for the theory to come apart, to go wrong. This is the Achilles heel of large-scale conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are attractive because they are designed to account for the relevant data. Indeed, they are created with the facts to be explained in mind. However, to explain all the data, grand conspiracy theories end up getting enormously bloated with lots of pieces and elements and moving parts. Large-scale conspiracy theories are thus inherently improbable, precisely because they're highly complex. There are simply too many ways for them to fail, too many ways for things to go wrong. So all things considered, Weinstein is correct. We ought to prefer the simplest theories when we're seeking to account for the data. Now, in this case, the data set to be explained is everything, all of reality, the entire universe of beings. Our question then is this: what's the simplest explanation or account for the existence of everything? One answer to that question is this: the universe is created by God. This is a very simple theory. It has, in fact, just one fundamental principle: God. God is the name that's given by theists to express the idea of a maximally perfect being, or a qualitatively infinite being, or being itself subsisting. God, then, is one possible explanation for everything. So what is Weinstein's explanation for the existence of everything? Let's see.
I don't know. I mean, where'd the universe come from? I'm not even sure we can know. Did God create an evolving universe, or did an evolving universe create God? It's one or the other.
So Weinstein doesn't have an alternative explanation, but he's an atheist, which means he rejects the God hypothesis. According to his own reasoning, this leaves him with the hypothesis that the universe somehow created God. Now, what he means here is that the universe created our false idea of God or our false belief in God, not that the universe literally created the being of God. So for Weinstein, whatever the explanation of the universe turns out to be, it's going to have to be a natural explanation rather than a supernatural one. But what would such a natural explanation look like? Again, Weinstein doesn't know. So let's see if we can help him out. Now remember, the principle of parsimony is our guide to the truth here. So we're going to need a natural explanation that is as simple as possible. What could that be? Well, how about this? What if we say that at the foundation level of reality is a single fundamental particle from which everything else in the universe evolved? That's pretty simple. It's hard to imagine a simpler explanation on purely naturalist terms. And if you don't like this option, you can feel free to insert your own physical thing here, a force, a quantum vacuum, a field of energy, whatever. Now we have two possible theories for how the universe came to be. Everything either came from God or from some physical symbol, like a fundamental particle. Here's the question. Which theory is more parsimonious? Well, I happen to think that the answer is clear. God is by far the simpler explanation. In fact, although the naturalist explanation is simple, relatively speaking, at closer inspection, it's actually quite complicated. Think about it. Even a single fundamental particle is complex in several respects. The particle will have to have parts of some kind. That is, it will have to have some distinct property or properties that characterize it as the thing that it is, and that account for its powers and features. In addition to the particle, we will plausibly have to posit laws of nature to explain how it is that the entire universe evolved from it. Moreover, the fundamental particle and the laws will all be limited or circumscribed in certain respects that add further complications to the theory. In other words, we need to know why these things have the specific bounds and restrictions that they have. Why does the particle have the features that it has and not some other features? Why these particular laws of nature rather than some other laws of nature? Whatever the naturalist posits as the explanation of the universe is going to be marked off by arbitrary limits, which will complicate the theory by requiring more information to describe and account for those limits. The God hypothesis is a more parsimonious theory, precisely because it posits one simple principle at the foundation of reality: God. God is a simple being. He's not composed of parts. Being immaterial, God has no physical parts. And according to the classical theistic understanding, God also lacks metaphysical parts. God has no properties distinct from his being. God has no essence that is distinct from his existence. All that is in God is God. Moreover, God is purely actual and thus utterly unbounded, unlimited, and unrestricted. As qualitatively infinite, God has no arbitrary limits that need to be defined or accounted for. When it comes to theoretical parsimony, then, theism, and especially classical theism, is far simpler than even the simplest conceivable form of naturalism. Weinstein's commitment to the principle of parsimony in the quest for truth ought to be leading him to theism. So why isn't it? Well, according to Weinstein, the God hypothesis faces a couple of problems.
For me, the problem with the hypothesis that there is a creator is that it answers one very difficult problem: where did the universe come from? At an expense that is vastly greater in terms of the assumptions, right? If the universe came from a creator, well, that simplifies one thing. But now we have to explain where that creator came from. And that's a much harder problem than explaining the universe itself. So as much as I agree explaining the universe and explaining biology is difficult, it does not solve a problem to imagine that a creator is the answer.
So Weinstein thinks that positing God to explain the existence of the universe doesn't actually work, since we're left with an even harder problem, namely that of explaining the existence of God himself. The universe came from God, but where did God come from? Here we have that infamous who created God objection, so popular among the old new atheists. But this is just a really bad objection that has been beaten to death, as anyone familiar with the philosophy of religion is well aware. Of course, Weinstein is not a philosopher of religion, or a philosopher of any kind for that matter, but a biologist, so perhaps we should give him a pass. After all, other notable biologists have offered the same silly objection. When Weinstein says that God answers one question related to the origin of the universe only by raising the more difficult question of the origin of God himself, he's not actually presenting an objection or a problem for the God hypothesis at all. According to that hypothesis, God is by definition the uncaused cause of everything other than himself. If you're talking about a being who requires a cause or an explanation for its existence, then you're not talking about the creator. You're talking about a creature. So, although Weinstein thinks he's offering an objection to the God hypothesis here, what he's really doing is simply changing the subject. Now, in the interview, Carlson actually tries to point out the fallacy here. Let's see how Weinstein responds.
The process is inherent in the description. So the creator is the force that creates and is not himself created. So in other words, God was not created. God has always been there, period.
Right. And I see, you can make the question go away, but I don't know what that means. We don't have any example of such a thing. So
No, we definitely don't, because everything apart from God is created.
So Weinstein says that a further problem for the God hypothesis is that we don't have an example of such a thing as an uncreated creator. But this is just flagrant question begging, because if God exists, then we do in fact have an example of such a thing. But perhaps I'm being uncharitable here. Maybe what Weinstein means is that we don't have an example of such a thing, scientifically speaking. In other words, maybe Weinstein is saying that the hard sciences have never been able to discover any such being as God. But again, how is this an objection to the God hypothesis? The hard sciences study the natural or the physical universe, but God's not part of the natural or physical universe. God transcends the universe as its metaphysical cause. Once again, Weinstein is changing the subject here. If he's thinking about a being that can, in principle, be detected and studied by means of scientific investigation, a being of which we might, in principle, provide an example of, well, then he's not thinking about God. Okay, we've gotten a little off course here. Remember, for Weinstein, the key to getting at the truth of things is this principle of parsimony. All things being equal, the simpler explanation is likely to be the true explanation. There are two explanations on the table: the God hypothesis and some maximally simple naturalistic hypothesis. Weinstein has thus far failed to offer any objection against the God hypothesis as such. And as we've seen, on the face of it, it's clearly the simpler theory. Unless Weinstein wants to abandon the principle of parsimony, he's going to have to show that a maximally simple naturalistic hypothesis is inherently more parsimonious than the God hypothesis. Now, there is one place in this discussion with Carlson that Weinstein takes a shot at this.
Can I just bring back to the beginning, though?
Sure.
If you said that the principle of parsimony is usually true, like the simplest explanation is the likely explanation. So my explanation for the creation of all things is God, who is not created but only creates, created all things. Pretty simple. Your explanation is what?
Well, let's put it this way. I've seen another version of this where you won't expect it. The many universes theory of quantum mechanics.
Yep.
You know this?
Yep.
So the basics are that in order to reconcile some of the oddities that quantum mechanics has discovered, we imagine that in every instant there is a universe spawned for every conceivable outgrowth. And so, if I pick up this pen, there's a universe in which I didn't and a universe in which I did. Right. And those universes go on to do whatever they do, right? This is a spectacularly simple explanation linguistically. It is the opposite of simple in terms of what it implies. You're going to create a universe for every conceivable nuance of interaction that every creature, every pebble that rolled down a hill, you're creating universes at this rate. That's not simple. That's complex at a level that's beyond extreme. And so my sense, and again, I'm not arguing that this isn't the better way to live, but my sense is when you say the simplest explanation is a creator who wasn't created, yeah, linguistically, that it doesn't get simpler than that. It's a one sentence, and you're done. At the level of what it means, it's almost inconceivably, what does it mean for something capable of creating a universe not to have come into existence? Right? I can't even imagine what that means, right?
Well, it is inconceivable. I mean, that's why you're the created, not the creator.
So Weinstein thinks that the God hypothesis suffers from a kind of explanatory complexity that makes it inherently improbable. To explain what he means, he provides the example of the many worlds theory of quantum mechanics to illustrate the kind of problem he has in mind. According to the many worlds interpretation, every time we make a quantum measurement, the universe branches off into parallel worlds, each one representing a possible value that the measurement can take. So according to the theory, all possible outcomes of a quantum measurement are physically realized as different universes every time a measurement is made. Weinstein's point is that the many worlds theory is simple in one respect while being extraordinarily complex in another respect. He says it's a spectacularly simple explanation linguistically. It is the opposite of simple in terms of what it implies. Weinstein then insinuates that the God hypothesis is just like this. To say that the ultimate explanation of everything is an uncreated creator is simple in one sense, linguistically, but what it implies is actually really complex. I'm not entirely sure what Weinstein is getting at with his illustration of the many worlds theory. He may be saying that God as an explanation is complex in the same way that a potentially infinite number of physically existing universes is complex. But if this is what he's saying, then he's once again badly missed the mark. This is because God is not a physical being, and he's therefore not subject to physical complexity. As we've seen, God is ontologically simpler than anything in the universe precisely because he's not composed of physical parts. And as I've already noted, classical theists have gone even further than this, denying of God even metaphysical parts. God is not just a simple being then. He is the simplest conceivable being. If this is indeed what Weinstein's objection amounts to, he's just given us an egregious example of the fallacy of false analogy. But let's be charitable here and assume that Weinstein is making a better argument than this. Let's assume that the point he's trying to make is that, like the many worlds theory, the God hypothesis is simple in one way, but again, like the many worlds theory, it's actually quite complex in another way, though not in the same way in which the many worlds theory is complex, thereby avoiding the false analogy. So let's see if we can develop this argument for Weinstein. Philosophers talk about two kinds of simplicity. The first kind is theoretical simplicity. This kind of simplicity is related to the number of fundamental principles that a theory posits to explain the data. Now, we've been considering this kind of simplicity already. The fewer the principles, the more probable the theory. I think this is roughly what Weinstein is trying to get at when he talks about something being simple linguistically. I think what he means is that the theory is theoretically simple and therefore simple to state or to articulate. The other kind of simplicity a theory can have is ontological simplicity. This kind of simplicity is related to the number of fundamental things and fundamental kinds of things that a theory posits to explain the data. Now, let's assume that Weinstein is arguing this way. Although the God hypothesis is simpler theoretically than are naturalist theories for the origin of the universe, the God hypothesis is nevertheless more complex ontologically than naturalistic theories for the origin of the universe. Think about it. According to the naturalist, there exists just one kind of stuff in the universe. material stuff. God, however, is not material. So in addition to the category of material things that the naturalist posits to explain the universe, the God hypothesis adds another kind of existing thing, namely an immaterial thing. Thus, the God hypothesis is more complex than the naturalist hypothesis because it has to posit the existence of more kinds of things to explain the same data. Now, at first glance, this objection appears to be pretty solid. After all, it does seem that the theist has one additional ontological commitment than does the naturalist. But on closer inspection, this objection begins to break apart. Because when it comes to the criterion of ontological simplicity, what matters is not merely the total number of things or kinds of things in the theory, but the number of things or kinds of things posited at the fundamental level in the theory. What matters for parsimony is the number of explanatorily basic or primitive things in the theory. In other words, the question is this: how many things and kinds of things do you have to postulate at the fundamental level of reality in order to explain the existence of everything else? As we've already seen at the fundamental layer of any naturalist theory of the origin of the universe, there will be multiple kinds of things with various complexities. There will be some basic physical stuff of some kind or other with a certain nature and certain properties. In addition, there will be other basic kinds of stuff, such as, for example, laws of nature, that will themselves be bounded by various parameters. In contrast to this, the God hypothesis is committed to there being just one fundamental individual thing, and just one fundamental kind of thing that is ontologically uncomposed, and therefore utterly simple. On theism, God is the sole fundamental entity, and on classical theism, there cannot even in principle be a simpler being than God. So even if it's true that the theist has to postulate one more kind of thing at the fundamental layer of reality than does the naturalist, this does not count against the simplicity of the God hypothesis, since God can unify and explain everything else in a more parsimonious way than the fundamental commitments of naturalism can. So however you bake the cake, the God hypothesis is going to come out on top when it comes to the principle of parsimony. Naturalist theories are inevitably burdened with greater complexity at the fundamental level. If Weinstein believes that the principle of parsimony is a guide to the truth, then he ought to be willing to follow it where it actually leads, and that's to theism, not to atheism. Now, so far we've been talking about the criterion of simplicity, or the principle of parsimony, that is used as a guide for theory selection and worldview comparison. But here it's important to point out that simplicity is not the only principle used to evaluate a theory. In fact, it's not even the most important principle. When it comes to theory evaluation and worldview comparison, the most crucial principle is not that of simplicity, but rather that of explanatory adequacy, also called explanatory comprehensiveness or explanatory power. If your theory is going to be a good one, it has to account for and explain all the facts under consideration. It does no good to have a simple or parsimonious theory that is explanatorily inadequate. So, for example, here's a very simple theory. At the foundational layer of reality, that which accounts for all else, is a single red jelly bean. This theory is pretty simple, but I hope you can see how inadequate it is as an explanation. The red jelly bean does nothing to explain the existence of anything else, let alone everything else. The red jelly bean can't even explain its own existence. To show this, consider that we can ask a whole lot of questions about the jelly bean that it cannot answer. How does it account for the existence of everything else? How does it account for its own existence? Why not something else instead? Why does it exist the way that it does instead of some other way? Why is it oblong? Why is it red? And on and on. The jelly bean theory is simple, but it leaves many things unexplained. It lacks explanatory power. It does no good simply to assert by arbitrary decree that it's just there, and that's that. It does no good to declare that the jelly bean exists necessarily. It's a necessarily existing jelly bean. this does no good because the jelly bean cries out for a deeper explanation, and simply declaring that its existence is a brute fact or that it exists in a necessary way does nothing at all to explain or to account for its existence. A jelly bean is clearly the kind of thing that requires some deeper explanation. Now, when we add the criterion of explanatory adequacy to the criterion of simplicity when evaluating our theories for the origin of the universe, things get a whole lot worse for the naturalist. To see why, remember that any naturalist theory is going to have to posit some basic physical stuff at the fundamental layer of reality. For the sake of analysis, let's just say that at the foundational layer of reality is a single electron. And if you don't like the electron in this example, you can substitute it for your favorite fundamental stuff. Again, other particles, fields, quantum vacuums, whatever you want. Now, I think it's easy to see that we can ask of this electron, or whatever fundamental stuff, the same questions that we asked of the jelly bean. How does this electron account for and explain the existence of everything else? How does this electron explain its own existence? Why an electron rather than some other fundamental particle, or nothing at all? Why does the electron have the properties that it has, rather than some other properties? Why is it limited and restricted and bounded in the precise ways that it is? Obviously, there's going to be a whole lot of things left unexplained on a naturalistic theory. Naturalism is going to be strapped with a whole lot of just there-ness and bruteness at the fundamental level of reality. And again, as with the jelly bean theory, simply declaring that the electron exists necessarily is not good enough. We want to know why it exists necessarily, since it seems clearly to be the kind of thing that cries out for a deeper explanation. Limited, bounded, restricted, physical stuff of whatever kind is just not the right kind of thing to qualify as the ultimate reality or as the ultimate explanation. And remember, naturalist theories are going to have to add other kinds of basic things at the fundamental layer of reality as well, like, for example, laws of nature defined by certain bounded parameters. These too will have to be posited as just their brute facts without any deeper explanation. And it gets worse because there are plausibly other kinds of things that will have to be tacked onto the naturalist theory as yet more just their brute facts, things that can't be explained by the fundamental physical stuff and the laws. And here I'm thinking of what philosophers today refer to as abstract objects or abstract propositions, such as those expressed in mathematics and logic and even in ethics that seem to exist, and necessarily so, while not being reducible to anything physical. And these are especially troublesome for naturalists because if, for example, mathematical truths exist, they are plausibly infinite in number. If this is the case, then the naturalist theory will have to include an infinite number of things at the fundamental level as just their brute facts without any further explanation. Now, of course, naturalists could simply deny the existence of abstract objects, but since many naturalist philosophers accept them, and for good reason, such a denial would make the theory that much more implausible. So naturalist theories are not just complex, they are explanatorily inadequate. Indeed, I think there's actually an inverse relationship here between these two criteria for the naturalist. If you increase the simplicity of the theory, well, then you'll decrease its explanatory adequacy, since you'll have to leave certain things unaccounted for by the theory. You'll have to have more just their brute facts. But if you increase the explanatory adequacy of the theory to account for these other things, you'll decrease its simplicity, since the theory will need to stitch together all the fundamental commitments in complicated ways by, for example, adding adjunct hypotheses, which in turn make the theory even less probable. So much for the naturalist theory, then. But what about the God hypothesis? Does it likewise falter on the criterion of explanatory adequacy? No, it doesn't. According to theism, all things that are not God are fully explained by God. God is the ground of the intelligibility of all reality external to himself. And this, of course, includes all physical reality, but it also includes any realities that cannot be reduced to the physical, such as abstract objects and truths. Theists have long maintained that necessary truths expressed in math and logic are grounded in God's being and intellect, which is itself qualitatively infinite. The God hypothesis is explanatorily unifying and powerful, as it can explain all the facts that need to be explained, physical or otherwise. Moreover, not only does God fully and simply explain the existence of everything outside of himself, he also fully explains the necessity of his own being. As we've seen, unlike anything physical, God has no arbitrary bounds, restrictions, or limitations that need to be accounted for. God, as classical theists have always maintained, is purely actual. And because God is simple and lacking in any physical or metaphysical parts, he's not dependent in any way on anything that's more basic than himself. Since God's essence just is existence, since God just is existence itself subsisting, God and God alone is ontologically independent. In other words, God is the only kind of thing that could possibly qualify as the ultimate reality, the only being that doesn't cry out for deeper explanation. So, unlike naturalistic theories, on theism, there's nothing that's left unexplained and unintelligible. On the classical God hypothesis, reality is intelligible through and through, with zero unexplained and unintelligible, just there brute facts. So when it comes to accounting for the totality of reality, theism is not only the simplest possible theory, it's also the most explanatorily powerful theory.